Namaskara and welcome to BIC Talks, a podcast brought to you by Bangalore International Centre, where we present conversations that move, inform, and encourage discourse.
So, stable norms of civility, so crucial to democracy and so relevant to our times, developed by a monarch in a totally different system, but abiding relevance for all of us today. It's an ancient political liberalism. What he's talking about is let's find a common ground. You have different views, but we have to find ways of living together, and we are looking for a common foundation. The impartiality of the monarch with respect to different religious philosophical perspectives is something which is absolutely necessary. It's incumbent on the ruler to be impartial. And there are terms like Vyavahar Samata, Danda Samata. These are terms that are used in the inscriptions. He's asking his officials to do that. These are elements that have been used by Ambedkar, Nehru, Gandhi, all of these elements in the building of or the invention of a tradition which can be called a democratic tradition.
Democracy, representing the will of the people, is the least imperfect form of government around today. However, this will of the people cannot remain unfettered, for without constitutional limits, democracy is often distorted. What challenges does India's constitutional democracy face? Rajeev Bhargava, founder-director of the Parekh Institute of Indian Thought at the Center for the Study of Developing Societies in New Delhi, will discuss multiple obstacles to constitutional democracy with a focus on the deep-rooted, long-standing mental and social habits that prevents the smooth functioning of constitutional democracy in India. This episode is adapted from an event that took place in the Bangalore International Centre in August of 2024.
My presentation today will be in 4 parts. In the first, I will make some preliminary remarks about the title, Deeper Vulnerabilities. In the second, I'll give an outline of my own broad conception of democracy. In the third, I think I should tell you that some of the lecture is based on an article that I was invited to write for a book which was part of the Ethicon series conceived by some political theorists abroad. And the title was Democracy and Morality, Secular and Religious Perspectives. And they gave me this challenge to write on democracy in the Hindu tradition. So I never really worked on anything like that, but I thought I'd take this up. And so I wrote a piece for them. And some of what I have to say here is drawn from it. And as you know, democracy is a modern, representative democracy, indirect democracy, and really democracy itself is a modern idea. So you can't really talk about the history of democracy and hope that you will find, some great democratic forms of government in the past and disrupted by some hostile forces only to be rejuvenated and then be born in some other. That story simply doesn't exist because democracy, as I said, isn't a very old idea. However, I do think that key elements that either go on to become constitutive features of modern democracy or are strong preconditions or prerequisites of democracy are available in the past, even in so-called monarchical systems. There can be democratic practices. There can be a milieu which has a very strong democratic element. I think it's important to recover and retrieve that. And I do think that there are some elements in India, and these elements are found in the very deep sort of past, Indian past. And those of us who want to literally invent in the sense in which Hobsbawm and Terence Ranger talked about invention of tradition, if they wish to reinvent a tradition of democracy, then they have to look at these elements. And, people like Nehru, Ambedkar, Gandhi, they did play a very important role in inventing such a tradition, or else our constitution would not have been we wouldn't have had the Constitution in 1950. So I think this also fulfills another need. I think all of us have the need to connect with a larger cosmic space. And just as we need to do that, we also have this need to connect ourselves with some deeper time. We want to relate to it. And I think you can also see this as part of that project of relating to some deeper past. And finally, I'll come to the real topic, the deeper vulnerabilities. What are the long-standing, deep-seated impediments to the proper functioning of constitutional democracy? Those impediments that make it fragile, that make it unstable, that continuously generate crises, and if they become too strong, they can even undermine democracy. And my focus is more on ideas because I am not good at anything else. So why deep vulnerabilities? When something is vulnerable, we know that it's prone to being damaged. It's extremely fragile. So there is a kind of inherent weakness somewhere. But these vulnerabilities can either be conjunctural, that is to say, many factors can contingently come together and make that entity prone to injury, to sickness, or to failure. Or these factors can be entrenched, very firmly established. There can be layers upon layers over years, sedimented. They're long-standing, they go back in time. And because they are so fixed and so well established, they're not that easy to dislodge. They don't disappear very easily. Even when you think that they're gone, they have a way of making a reappearance. And therefore, you need sustained effort, a very hard, long, collective struggle in order to reduce their impact, or at least, if not altogether, get rid of them. I don't know if we can ever get rid of these things, but since there are social constructs, I think they can be removed. They're not natural, but still, we have a hard time even noticing them. And after we begin to notice them and acknowledge them, hard time getting rid of them. These are our psychosocial habits, these mental and social habits that are ingrained in us. We are not even conscious of some of them. And even when they've been written about, we tend to forget them because we tend to forget the relevance of those texts where they're found. So what is my understanding of democracy? Just before I was kind of putting my notes together for this lecture, I looked at a recent Journal of Democracy, the recent issue of the Journal of Democracy, and I found a very famous political theorist, Adam Brzezinski. He had given the following definition of democracy. Democracy, he says, is a system in which citizens collectively decide by whom and to some extent how they will be governed. That looks like a pretty decent definition. And he adds, it's the same paragraph, short, a regime is democratic if and only if people are free to choose, including to remove governments. I think there's something missing here. Either some key features of democracy are assumed to be so obvious by Adam Brzezinski. They're so obvious that he doesn't even consider them worth mentioning. But for a political theorist to do that is a little odd because they want to make everything inarticulate, articulate. They want to make everything implicit, explicit, and they want to define things, and even those things which cannot really be defined and should not be defined. It's an omission. Wittingly or unwittingly, he's omitted something. And if this is an omission, for whatever reason, I think it's shocking. So what are these? He talks about democracy being a system in which citizens collectively decide. But who are these citizens? In my view, a democracy that is not inclusive is not really a democracy. In other words, all people living in a particular territory, regardless of religion, gender, class, education, caste, race, all are citizens. And I think this is something which we need to mention. A modern democracy is definitionally inclusive. You cannot exclude any group of people merely on account of some feature which is a kind of a permanent and durable feature of those groups. Second, it doesn't say, which is so obvious, all citizens have to be equal. You cannot have a democracy where there is no equality of citizenship. How can there be a democracy if some people in that system are living as second-class citizens? In other words, their rights are not the same as the rights of other citizens. If they don't have the right to stand for public office, for example, then you don't really have a democracy. So unequal second-class citizens are not citizens. And I think in this definition, you'll see that neither equal citizenship nor inclusive citizenship is a part of the definition. And the third, a regime is democratic if and only if people are free to choose, including to remove governments. But how? I think the third very important thing, which ought to be explicit, is that this choice must be completely unconstrained and certainly free from the threat of violence. Pacification of politics is a precondition of democracy and should be part of the understanding, if not the definition of democracy. So you can't have power being transferred under the threat of violence or violence. You cannot have a violent transfer of power. There has to be a peaceful transfer of power. That's absolutely central to democracy. So pacification of politics is also central. Now, many features follow from this idea of inclusive, equal citizenship and peaceful transfer of power. I would say that this is part of a minimalist definition of democracy. I say minimalist because very often in political theory, one makes a distinction between minimalist and maximalist. Minimalist are democracies which are constituted by intrinsic qualities or intrinsic values, and maximalists are those which also include within them extrinsic values. So, for example, if you say we have democracy in order to achieve economic equality, or you have democracy because you want to have a very high level of development of productive forces, superior technology. I mean, it's a little odd to think of that, but still, you could think that only in democracies can you have a really high-class, highly developed technological society. Then, of course, that will be outside of the core features of democracy. But this, which Prajovsky talks about, minimalist, I think all of these, even though this looks like a very, very thick idea, I think this is part of the minimalist conception of democracy. It follows, for example, from inclusiveness that the state or the system cannot really have a strong alliance with any one linguistic, religious, or ethnic group. So I don't see how a Christian state or an Islamic state or a Hindu state, which is already given privilege to one section of people living in the territory, how that can be a democratic state, because it excludes certain groups, right? Similarly, principle of non-discrimination, again, is very central to equality of citizenship. If you have some people who are excluded from certain key aspects of well-being generated by democracy, or they're excluded from the democratic process, not excluded, discriminated by the state in the democratic process, then you really don't have you don't have a democracy. Okay? If pacification of politics is a key feature of democracy, if violence is not acceptable in a democracy, obviously we're talking about ideals where really, there are lots of ways in which violence is endemic to many so-called democracies. But that sort of reduces their democratic quality. It doesn't enhance it. It doesn't make them adequate to the idea of democracy. But if that is the case, if there is pacification of politics, and if people have to collectively choose their representatives or collectively decide on issues which are of central concern to them, on which decisions are absolutely necessary, then there will be difference, and this difference has to be sorted out. If not removed, at least people have to sit down, not literally sit down, but sit together or communicate together and arrive at some decision. And all this presupposes the presence of an open and vibrant public sphere, public space, where matters are openly expressed, discussed, and debated. There is free exchange and contestation that takes place. And it also implies that dissent is going to be tolerated. If people are dissenting from your views, you're not going to persecute them. It also presupposes that all people who differ from you and who compete with you, who are your rivals, will be seen only as temporary adversaries and not as permanent enemies. So the idea of the other as an enemy, that is not very conducive to democracy. The other thing that becomes quite important in the whole democratic process is that when you have to arrive at certain decisions, especially over which you have deep disagreements, then you learn to live with the second best solution rather than the one that maximizes your interests. In other words, the ability to arrive at a compromise, not compromise over principles, but compromise over differences which may emerge from competing principles or competing applications of principles, right? You're prepared to negotiate and compromise on them. And these requires two key virtues, which are very central to public participation and to citizenship. One is what I called Sanyam, self-restraint, and the other is the quality of being Bahushruta, which is to listen to the many, which implies open-mindedness. You're willing to listen to everybody. So these are two key values of citizenship, virtues of citizenship. Finally, effective citizenship presupposes that everyone has a modicum of well-being. I don't think it is part integral to democracy that there be economic equality. I don't hold that view. But it's crucial that everybody, in order to effectively exercise their citizenship, they have some minimum material level of well-being. I will focus on what I broadly call not the Hindu as derived from modern Hinduism, but Hindu in the older sense. This is widely sort of Hindu tradition. It's much more inclusive than you think it is. So elements that go deep into those multiple traditions, which give strength to modern democracy, and then finally elements that go deep in that tradition, which one should really be wary of because they can gravely undermine Indian democracy. Okay, as we know, democracy today is going through a very rough patch everywhere, not just in India, but everywhere. And a number of factors threaten democracy. Just prepare a random sort of list of what came to my mind. Just very quickly, populism, a certain misuse of social media that gives rise to demagoguery on the one hand, and which is hell-bent upon collapsing the distinction between what is really true, reasonably true, and what is false. Information overload, which creates a lot of confusion. Very inhumane, robust capitalism, which is only profit-motivated. That all capitalism is, but this is something, absolutely unprincipled, robust capitalism, which is so pervasive today, crony, monopolistic, whatever you might call it, which springs from just no compassion, a lot of intense greed, the idea of grabbing things at whatever cost, then the misuse of the legal machinery, the selective use of legal machinery, the growth of conditions whereby you actually want to liquidate the opposition or to asphyxiate the opposition by misusing the legal machinery, by a selective use of the legal machinery. Then electoral machinery makes sure that you don't have a neutral, impartial electoral machinery. The electoral machinery itself is manipulated in such a way that it only favors one, not the others. Total control of media, a climate of fear, keeping people on the edge all the time. A lot of harassment. So you're neither put in jail, but not you feel safe and secure. You're always on the verge of being raided by some department or the other. And also infantilizing the opposition. Very, very common these days. It's part of the right-wing toolkit, right? You just make the opposition, try to make the opposition ineffective by any means. And one of the ways in which you do that is by making them look like they're always, dumb, foolish, idiotic, silly, nothing care, and so on. I can go on, destroying self-correcting mechanisms. Yes, of course, institutions being undermined. Now, all these are very, very important. And somebody who really wanted to give analysis of what ails democracy and why democracies are on the verge of dying out will spend a lot more time on all these factors. But as I said, I wanted to focus on deep, long-standing impediments and therefore on those mental and social habits. And I will quickly come to that. But I just want to say that there is a connection between all this that I've listed and what I'm going to say towards the end. And that is that all these things are reactivated See, they rely on this list of factors that I mentioned, which are undermining democracy. They are getting a lot of their purchase and a lot of the weight by somehow reactivating those traditional deep-seated impediments. And so there are people who are out there trying to appeal to those aspects, those ideas in those texts, which are anti-democratic, part of the anti-democratic tradition. They appeal to them, but they don't even have to appeal to them because these are set in our patterns of behavior. We haven't really tackled them over a period of time enough. So they're part of our social imaginary. They're part of our collective understanding. So, yeah, before I come to what I'm really going to focus on, but I don't think I can do that before I mention at least one or two things that have made it possible for us to sustain democracy in India. They were part of the inspiration behind the anti-colonial struggle, and not only our anti-colonial struggle, but constantly telling us, as we were fighting British imperialism, that what will come in its place is something which is really worthwhile, which is going to be inclusive, and which is we will have a constitution, a constitutional democracy. So what are these features in the Indian traditions which might strengthen our democracy and which all of us should very proudly claim? The first of this is the idea that there are many gods and goddesses, and they're all translatable. They live in the same semantic universe. Even though some gods and goddesses have some kind of an ontological, hierarchical relationship, many cases these are equivalent. So that a god and goddess in one culture can easily be translated as of equal value in the culture of some other, the gods and goddesses from other culture. Behind this idea is a very interesting idea. This is normally, in 18th century, this was, people invented a term called polytheism for that. But I think this is a very deeply pluralistic idea. And what is interesting about it is that it rules out the other idea that's competing with it and which is hostile to it, which is that there is one true God and all the other gods are false. This idea that you have to have exclusive monotheism, the idea there has to be exclusive allegiance, that idea is there. This is an idea which is very ancient. It's there in all cultures. It was there in the Arab region. It was there in Africa. It is certainly there in Asia, and it was present in India too. What is helpful in India is that just at the time that in some parts of Egypt and in Palestine, just when this new idea was coming up that there is one true God and all other gods are false, in India, instead of this idea replacing the idea of multiple gods and goddesses, or even inclusive monotheism, which is the idea that all these multiple gods and goddesses are manifestations of one God. Gandhi later used this a lot. Just around this time, we were developing a very strong, what we might call, tradition of atheistic worldviews. Mimamsa is completely non-reliant on the idea of God. Even gods and goddesses are not important. Buddha, early Buddhism, is completely free of the idea of God. Jainism is free of the idea of God. And I think what is important in India, particularly, I don't know about other cultures, I'm sure that is the case in China around the same time. In India, we were finding ways of accepting that there are different ethics of self-fulfillment, and some are gods and goddesses dependent, some are a single God dependent, and some don't depend at all on either God or gods and goddesses. And this very deep pluralism of cohabitation of different worldviews, we were developing that in the first millennia before the Common Era. So I think this has been a great sort of advantage to our traditions here, as indeed it has been until very recently, at least in Japan and China, in many Asian cultures. This is one big thing for inclusiveness, and this deep pluralism is something that we really need to protect. And I see the Sarv Dharm Sambhav idea. The dharm, of course, is a wrong, it's a mistranslation, but we can well imagine what is meant by this, that all these different religious, philosophical worldviews have to be deeply respected. We don't have to be in each, but we can empathize with even those that are radically different from us. So that's one. The second I got, this is the most important thing in our tradition, which is Ashoka, Ashokan thinking, who is inventing a new socio-political ethic. And there are 5 features which I need to mention quickly. One is pacification, the idea of pacification of politics, the idea that war must not be the way, that physical conquest must be replaced by what he called moral, dhammic conquest. That, I think, is extremely important. And when he apologizes, and this is there in the inscriptions, when he shows contrition and he apologizes, that apology is not merely in word, it's an action, it's something that he doesn't want to do ever again. The idea of imperial conquest in Ashoka. So that's one, pacification. The second is this invention of the idea of Dhamma, which I call socio-political ethic, which is not only for the ruled, but equally for the ruler. So something above all of us, which we all have to, in a sense, abide by, which the ruler must abide by as much as the ruled. And that is the source of the idea of the Constitution, in a way. I mean, it's the earliest ideas of Constitution are found here in the Ashokan idea of Dhamma. Third, the duty of the king is to, these are words that I'm using from his inscriptions, Sarva Jana Hita, Sarva Jana Sukha. So it's the idea that the ordinary lives of people matter. Not only of people, that is to say human beings, but also of all living animals. And there are lots of passages where he talks about what he must do in order to somehow make the lives of both human beings and animals much better than they are. So that idea, I remember I talked about modicum of well-being as an important key. So this is again something that develops in monarchical systems that can be of great use even later when we move to different systems. Then treatment of slaves, of prisoners, servants. So a certain degree of minimal decency has to be there. Ashoka has specific, not injunctions, because he doesn't believe, after a certain point, he doesn't believe in commanding. He pays much more emphasis on nijjati, persuasion, rather than niyama, which is law. And so he wants to tell us how we must treat slaves. So this is a society which has servants, it has slaves, it has prisoners. So we shouldn't delude ourselves into believing that all these things that exist. There's a monarchical system, there are subjects, there is slavery, but there are limits to what you can do to even slaves. And of course, when we abolish these things, then things have to be hugely different, but there is a certain idea of minimal decency. And then the absolutely stunning idea of what I call Sanyam, Paushruta, civility. But this is something which is extremely important. Ashoka recognizes that we have what he calls pashandas. We have different religio-philosophical groups. And he says, well, they cannot live separately. They cannot live in ghettos. They have to live face to face. But when they live face to face and they encounter one another, I am adhering to one worldview and the other person is adhering to another worldview and they're living face to face. So how do they relate to one another? And Ashoka says, well, if you are committed to your worldview and you are against somebody else's worldview, or meaning you differ from his worldview, there are bound to be things that you dislike about that person or his views, but don't keep them, don't privatize them, don't keep them within yourself. Say them out, but only on 3 conditions. All of this stated in the so-called 12th edict, which is not really an edict, but it is in the 12th inscription and found in multiple places all over India and in Afghanistan and Pakistan. What are they? Say, be critical of the other if you have a good reason to. Even when you have a good reason to, only on an appropriate occasion. And even when the occasion is appropriate, moderately, never immoderately. Because if you do it immoderately, not only will it be counterproductive, but it'll be demeaning. This is not what he says, but it's to be inferred. But not only that, if you are committed to your worldview, then you'll be dying to say something good about that worldview. Otherwise, your commitment is worthless. You have to. So don't keep it to yourself, say it. If you think that there is something good in your worldview, say it to a person who doesn't agree with you. But again, only under 3 conditions. Do it with good reason, appropriate occasion, moderately, not immoderately. No self-glorification. This is something which is mentioned in the inscription. Don't go, gaga about, And all this is important. This encounter is important for Bahushruta. Listen to the many. And this encounter is important for mutual growth. Your own worldviews are imperfect. And God knows they'll never be perfect. But it's only through mutual encounter that you will enable the growth of one another, and you will enable the growth of Dhamma, which is that overall morality, ethic, social, political ethic, right? So stable norms of civility, so crucial to democracy and so relevant to our times, developed by a monarch in a totally different system, but abiding relevance for all of us today. It's an ancient political liberalism. What he's talking about is, let's find a common ground. Let's find you have different views, but we have to find ways of living together. And we are looking for a common foundation. The impartiality of the monarch with respect to different religious philosophical perspectives is something which is absolutely necessary. It's incumbent on the ruler to be impartial. And there are terms like Vyavahar Samta, Danda Samata. These are terms that are used in the inscriptions. He's asking his officials to do that. These are elements that have been used by Ambedkar, Nehru, Gandhi, all of these elements in the building of or the invention of a tradition, which can be called a democratic tradition. Now, what is it that is impeding all this? Which is as strong as, and sometimes stronger than, and today certainly is even stronger. I will mention 4 such things. One is the presence of a violent, masculine, warrior ethic. It's there in the Rig Veda. It's understandable, in a time, when there are people looking for more territories. I mean, I'm not justifying it, but in the Rig Veda, it's very clear. Warrior ethic that glorifies violence. And the big hero is Indra, who's not only the god of sky, rain, and thunder, but he's also the god of war. And there are verses which say, well, through sheer brawn, he pushes apart the world. He breaks it into 2 halves, heaven and earth. And the language that is used to glorify Indra is extremely masculine and violent. And I'm just summarizing it. There are long passages in the paper that I've written. With his ojas, a Sanskrit term signifying both physical strength and power of rulership and domination, Indra smashes and pulverizes rivals. He destroys, he crushes, he slays, he breaks an enemy's rage. He has a terrifying demeanor, and he embodies male domination and female submission. And this is extremely important in cattle raiding expeditions and in territorial conquests. These are the qualities that really matter. Notice how different it is from civility. The qualities matter are shura, veer. It's a kind of courage in the battlefield, courage in warfare. Certainly, this is a very important element. And I can see this has been present it's in every kingship. This is an important ethic. Regardless of early India, Middle India, I'm sure there must be local traditions in Central Asia. Nobody can dare conquer if he did not have these as standards. So those who came from Turks, the Afghans, the Uzbekis, I mean, they must have their own traditions of this kind, and they must have found this very valuable. I can well imagine. So a warrior ethic, and even today, I can see it in behavior of so many males. This is a thriving culture in India. The second element of the antidote is the Arthashastra, undoubtedly, because Arthashastra, as Patrick Oliver has told us, is addressing an absolute monarch who rules in accordance with his will. It's arbitrary will. He doesn't follow any law. And statecraft has priority over everything else. Dharma is barely mentioned, if after all it's a treatise on Artha. Artha is this worldly success. It's not economic alone. It's primarily a political text. It's political. It's success in achieving power by any means, by hook or by crook. No moral constraints. So what we are getting here is an articulation of a domain of politics that is completely abstracted from morality, from religiosity, and from metaphysics. And this is a very important element in the anti-democratic tradition in India. Our politics is saturated by the Arthashastra ethic. Whether people actually mention it or not is another matter. But this is something which is very, very strong. Grab, by any means, power, hold on to it, accumulate it. Not money alone, money too. After all, this worldly success includes money, all of that. So this, I think, how it sort of easily merges with this robust capitalism that I just mentioned, how it merges with it. It's a treatise for capitalists and for power-hungry politicians, which is something we've inherited. It's part of us. The third, of course, is the Dharamshastric tradition. I'll quickly go over it. I can say much more about it. I think there are incipient ideas of what we call religion, but the basic thing is a justification of caste hierarchies and the injunction to the king to sustain social order, which is saturated by graded inequality, hardly conducive to democracy. And you can see that it's a mindset that is so prevalent and it's so difficult to dislodge, both patriarchal and justifying the Varna system. And this is one of the most difficult because it's so much a part of our social imaginary. It's normative. We ought to be like that. That is the big difficulty. People expect the other to abide by, even though he or she doesn't benefit from it at all. And only some people benefit from it. But it's the dharma of the Atishudra to serve, or the Shudras to serve, and it's serve who? The high and mighty. And it is not a matter of preference. It's not that I want you to do it. It's something which is, it's a normative order. You can see the strength of it. And the last bit is something which comes later. These are going really deep into our past. The Dharmashastra is written down in the Manav Dharmashastra, 1st century, after the Common Era. Arthashastra is somewhere around the same time. The Rig Vedic, the masculine, that is 1500 BC. But this is new. What? What I call religionization of India. Modernity has brought in not secularization, but religionization of India. What do I mean by that? I think we had religio-philosophical perspectives, we had religio-philosophical experiences, but the framing of these experiences was not through the category of what we call religion. We did not have religion. There were embryonic elements of religion, as I said, in the Dharamshastra. There are certainly very strong elements of this religion which come in 16th century against Akbar, funnily, not to aid Akbar, who's conducting different, very fascinating experience with religious views and so on. But there is the Naqshbandi order coming from Afghanistan with Sirhandi. All these people, they want to destroy. They are responsible for the murder of Abul Fazl. They are the ones who are bringing in an idea of religion. But they are not fully successful. A real consolidator of all this is late 18th century, early 19th century idea of Christ, which come with colonial missionaries. And we have this idea of religion. Now, what does religion add to all of this, which all these philosophical experiences, religious experiences, religiosity is very old, but three things. One is that idea of true and false religion that I mentioned, which is virtually absent in early India and continues to be highly contested all through. Not only can you in Kabir, Dadu, all these great figures, but also in the first millennia, you can look at, we've been reading these texts, Jayanta Bhatta's Agam Dambara, Kashmiri Shaivite text, which is so pluralistic, a defense pluralism against the idea of exclusive truth and falsehood. Second, the formation of communities which are very well demarcated, sharply demarcated. And identities are defined in terms of these demarcated communities, which are sharply distinguished from one another. And these identities are categorical. So it's not just the other. The other is not only a radical other, he's an enemy to be fought. Adherence to my doctrine comes with an enemy to be fought. There's a new idea of rivals being permanent enemies, competitors being permanent enemies. And eventually, in 1925, with Mr. Savarkar, the idea that each religious community must have a state of its own. Now, that is something which is a European idea, ethno-nationalist, ethno-religious nationalist idea, which comes in 1492 in Spain, and then it flowers during the wars of religion. This is deeply undermines pluralism. It creates divisions and conflict and even violent conflict. And we know the upsurge of communal violence in early 20th century in India. as a result of this great infection. These ideas are not just Shastric, even though I mentioned a lot of Arthashastras and this and that, but they are certainly part of our common understanding. They are habits of the heart, of the mind, social habits. They're very difficult to dislodge. We should never be living in the illusion that by creating the Constitution, by having some electoral democracy, we'll get rid of all this. This is a long battle.
You have been listening to BIC Talks by Bangalore International Centre. If you like what you heard, do follow us on social media. Keep up with our programming by signing up for our mailer on the website or leave us a review or rating on Apple Podcasts or iTunes. The crew that makes these podcasts possible is Gaurav Krishna and Ishan Gupta on sound supervision and production, with support from S. Sarunaraj and Raghu Tenkaila. Artwork is designed by Chandni Venkataraman of Crisscross Design Studio. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel on your favorite podcast platform. It can also be accessed on our website, bangaloreinternationalcentre.org. This is Lekha Naidu signing off on behalf of everyone at BIC.